not necessarily that it's bad, is coming about because of economic forces in industry. But the biggest force in legislation is coming from the fear of downward mobility. That's really the political driver. You all know this is the first generation in which children are expected to do less well than their parents. And Americans, we're a wonderful people, but we do have some character faults. One of our character faults is that we prefer nostalgia to actual history. Right? So we have this mythology that because the founding fathers, people carry the Constitution in their briefcases in Washington, D.C., right, as the protectors of them, somehow they think that democracy will always be here, right, because of the founding fathers in these documents. Actually, democracies are very fragile. Smart policymakers know this. And if people can no longer improve their life through hard work and education, our basic social contract is threatened and undermines democracy. And across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, in my work in legislatures and with governor's offices, people are truly worried about this, and they know that education is the only remaining route to upward mobility. It used to be government jobs for poor people. They're disappearing really quickly. It used to be the military, especially for people of color, and those military is downsizing. The poor people can't pass the test to get into the military. Small business is under severe constraints and is not hiring. So really, it's us that's the force for upward mobility in society. And how bad is the problem? Intergenerational elasticity of income, great use of logarithms and differential calculus to understand what that is. But we have actually fallen behind France and Italy in the rate at which you can advance given your parents' income. The idea that we would be behind France, we're just about tied with the UK, with the second or third worst country in the world in terms of income elasticity. That's what's actually driving the policy agenda toward completion. Industry pressures to subsidize their workforce training, which is understandable, and deep structural changes in American life. If too many Americans no longer believe that they have paths upward, we are in trouble. And for upper income people, degrees don't matter so much. Actually, 89% of all people in the top quartile of income earn a BA within 6 years. It's 11% for people in the bottom quartile of income. Right? Just think of that. So this is about low-income people actually having a route up, and if you're poor, a certificate or license or degree profoundly matters to your upward mobility, much more so than for middle and upper income people. So when we hear people arguing about factoring versus completing the square and having deep emotional debates about what should be taught, it's worthwhile to take a breath and step back and remember what we're actually working on, which is the viability and continuation of our democratic traditions and social contract. At least half our energy should be focused on that, rather than whether students should all be able to rationalize binomial surd denominator or do tricky factoring of quartics. So, funding formulas get the attention of administrators. So how is higher ed responding? Then I'm going to shift to talk about my visits to 40 campuses and innovation that I really respect and lessons from it. And then I'm going to talk a little about the need to design at scale rather than designing pilot projects. What I see is the next iteration of your work. So how is universities responding? Universities are old institutions. We have evolved incredibly efficient immunological systems to thwart even the most beneficial of viruses affecting our cores. And how do we do this? Well, you're the president. There's an initiative out here. You serve as the buffer. You create a task force. You create a P20 business council in which each sector hires somebody with little influence in their own sector to meet with the people in the other sectors. I personally think they should all hire out-of-work actors, so at least we'd be contributing to the arts. Then there's an army of 18-year-old, physically well-toned consultants from McKinsey, Bridgespan, BCG, and Parthenon, spouting the language of productivity, which should cause you to run screaming from the room. Very bright young people who could be replaced by a computer program, because they're all giving virtually isomorphic advice. This is a symbolic plane of activity. But because it's about money and actually how our institutions are going to be funded, we're seeing real structural change taking place, operational activity, not just symbolic activity, which is designed to protect the core. And you can see this in several ways. Real questions are being asked about the viability of programs, and real questions are being asked about enrollment. And one of the reasons is the first institutions that stood up and actually adopted completion-oriented practices, the Oregon community colleges, the Georgia system, they eliminated late enrollment, mandatory advising, all the things the research shows is necessary, all experienced drops in enrollment because students didn't organize their lives so they could do them. And as soon as they adopted completion-oriented practices, enrollment fell, which threatened their fiscal viability, because their current funding is based mostly on enrollment, not on success. That's what's really getting the attention of presidents. So presidents, for the first time, and their governing boards are asking hard questions. Why aren't students graduating in STEM? Right? We can't just hire people as we used to solve the problem. We have to ask, how are our real institutional resources being deployed? The whole history of minority programs and women's programs and access programs is, well, let's not touch the real departments. Let's hire people around the edges to fix the problem. And that's not working anymore, because we have 40 years of data to show that none of those innovations actually survive, right? They're always funded with soft dollars, which tells you about real institutional commitments. And that is changing because of state policy and national need. So, what else happening on the real level? So for the last 4 years, I've been visiting campuses as part of my work on the redesign of community colleges and access four-year institutions. That means I've spent the first day of a visit teaching in the institution. I've learned that it's impossible to learn what's going on in an institution just by speaking to the president or provost. The first lesson is, every president I've spoken to has a virtually identical description of their institution. This is stunning. So principle one is rhetoric scales faster than practice. They all have learning communities. They all have boot camps. They all have case management. Right? They've all shifted their IR from compliance to improvement. I mean, virtually in 40 case studies, virtually no identifiable differences in the institutional description of a place when described by the president. But when you go in and you teach for a day, so usually I teach like a developmental course, calculus, linear algebra, right? Your cross-section of math courses. It's hard to believe that the places all have the same name of higher ed. In some places, it feels like you're in some Midwestern gas station where students drive up, get filled up, and drive away. Nobody is hanging around. And in other places, it feels like you're in a community center. I was in Indian River in Florida. As soon as I walk on, the gardeners, stop me. Where are you going? Are you a new student here? Me, am I a new student? Right? I mean, it's stunning. Students hanging around. Math departments that have hired students and replaced student support personnel with their own students. I mean, really fundamental differences. So lesson one is that rhetoric doesn't actually reflect practice. Lesson 2 is that pilots do not scale. So I was at a large institution in Ohio, and I had the faculty math department, my kindred spirits. We put a butcher paper around the room, and it's a large department, and we did an exercise. Write down every effort you remember in your career to improve retention in math, recruit students into math, improve performance. 81 different initiatives were remembered. Then we did some descriptive statistics. Turned out the mean length of an initiative was about 3 years. 1.5 faculty were involved. About a quarter of the faculty were, at any time in their career, were involved in an improvement effort. About half the faculty were occasionally involved, and a quarter just sort of did their own thing. Right? So at the end of this, we did the descriptive statistics, and then I asked the question, which of these have replaced institutional practice, had become normative practice? And the answer was 0. So I'm ready for my, Xanax or whatever it is, clinical depression. So I'm being driven by the vice president for academic affairs to the airport after the day. And I said to him, man, wasn't that depressing? And he said, oh, no, Uri, you don't understand. All those grants, they're about faculty development. They're not really about institutional change. But that's in fact the reality, right? They're really seen as ways of mobilizing, supporting, entertaining the faculty who are working with students. Almost no pilot project. There are a handful of exceptions, but almost no pilot project has ever scaled and become institutional. NSF knows this in its heart. It's a joke at the coffee counter. But we're addicted to this mythology that pilots will scale. We need to end that mythology and talk about designing for scale rather than praying for scale. The third is the myth of the N. It's usually 7. Exemplary practices, high-yield, powerful practices. One of my closest friends is a devout Mormon, and he calls this the Mormon approach to institutional improvement. My people prefer guilt-based approaches. My wives prefer shame-based approaches. But the fact is, when you list these exemplary practices and then you look at the literature, RCTs done on these, they virtually always show 0 effect. And there is a beautiful literature on this in K-12. Some of the great figures, Jimmy Spillane, Richard Elmore, really the brilliant thinkers of K-12 used to believe, it's an exercise, I used to believe this, I now believe this. Every year on January 1st, when we get up, we should sit down, close our eyes, take a deep breath, and say, I used to believe this, I now believe this, and honor what we've learned. One of the things we've learned in K-12 is that just as many crappy institutions have those practices as good institutions, which is why when you do randomized controlled trials of things named learning communities or boot camps, you get 0 effect. This was the What Works Clearinghouse, remember that? I always hoped that NSF would create what should have worked clearinghouse. And then DARPA could have created a what had no chance in hell of working clearinghouse. But it turns out that practices matter, but the catalyst for making them matter is institutional culture and relational trust. And probably the single best research study in education in the last 30 years, a masterpiece of rigor and clarity, is Tony Bragg's Organizing Schools for Improvement. And he shows 7 years of rich data that in institutions without relational trust catalyzed by leadership, no intervention works. right? He actually built causal models for this. So the natural thing is saying, what works, let's put it in place and hope that will be catalyzed into achievement. It's culture and relational trust on campuses that turns practices into student achievement. It's not the 7, 10, 12, 15. I can do that improvement in 6 highly effective practices. So that's one of the big myths. The fourth, one of the most painful myths, is that remediation works. Remediation is a burial ground for the aspirations of myriad students, mostly poor people, hoping for a better education. Every big data set shows that if students are referred to remediation, they're more likely to end up with debt than with a certificate, license, or degree. And our institutions have hired an army of contingent workers making $1,800 to $2,700 a course to work with poor people and put it over here in a little remedial ghetto. So what's the data? About 5.9% of students referred to math remediation pass a college math course in their first year. About a quarter of them ever pass a college math course. At a large community college in Southern California, as part of my visits, I asked the institutional research people if I could meet with all the students who started in level 1 remediation who completed the calculus sequence over 3 years. I was going to take them to dinner, do a focus group, film them, and capture their stories. Her name was Rosa Martinez. Charming woman. It took her 7 years to get through, engineering aide, amazing person. But here's a hint. I teach advanced statistical modeling at the University of Texas. When you can name everyone in your sample, you're in trouble. You don't need third-order moments of probability distributions, anything of that sort. Here's a photograph. She's the one who made it through. This is criminal. Right? It's become a cost center in most institutions. This is unethical, and funding little dinky improvements of remedial education is not helping people of color or low-income people succeed. The problem, yes, failure rates are high, but here's the failure rates based on Florida complete data and California data. 59% of African American students in regular college credit math courses get W's, D's, F's, or I's. 53% of Hispanics, 40% of whites, and 37% of Asians. So we have armies of people trying to build a 6-lane highway into a swamp. People love working on remediation because it's another way to divert attention from the core courses and structures in our institutions, which have deep dry rot. So I started in community college. I started in the horticulture program. I worked for 5 years in grounds and maintenance at Los Angeles Community College. I remember my first course at Pierce Community College, Gardening 101. Robert Connell, I was so lucky. He was the main landscaper at UCLA. He walked out and he said, 2 lessons, day 1. Don't build a garden before you watch where people walk. Never build structures on weak foundations. Yes, most important lesson I've had in all my years of education. If we're really going to build structures, focusing on remediation without focusing on the strong anchors in K-12 and in our institutions is going to fail. And poor people and people of color are going to be the primary victims of that institutional irresponsibility. The next myth is that high school, the problem is essentially decrepit American high schools. We have allowed the rhetoric of failure to dominate discussions of public education, but not higher ed. We're Teflon covered. The danger of focusing on the putative weaknesses of American K-12 education, and we have to be careful of this when flashlight shines on us, is that the negativity has turned what used to be a beacon of hope in America, public education, into a symbol of government failure. So data is critical, and we need to understand our weaknesses, but we had better understand our strengths first. Because if we fail to present a balanced view of our institutions, we too will end up being seen as a symbol of government failure, rather than for the important roles we actually play. K-12, we've allowed secretaries of education of both parties to characterize K-12 as a complete and total failure. To show this stupid PISA data, which is completely misrepresentative, and no one talks about the TIMSS data, which just came out, in which U.S. states participated as countries, and Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina outperformed every European country, and Finland, which came in top on PISA, underperformed the U.S. national average. No discussion of this in the press, because we're addicted to failure as a driver for improvement. Discussion of failure and threat produces a short-term blip in behavior followed by denial. That's what social psychologists have learned. We have to be very careful about the portrayal of those institutions. The real data is we've seen increases in calculus enrollment. In 1982, only half of American high school students took Algebra 1 and geometry. Most states now are requiring 3 or 4 years of mathematics. My state 4. We hope it will stay that way. What we haven't done is build bridges from the new strengths of high school advanced course taking into the freshman year of college. The institutions that have done that, South Texas College in the Rio Grande Valley, now has 12,084 high school students who are poor and middle performing enrolled in their regular college classes out of 31,000. Remediation has dropped from 40% to 16.1% in a decade, and the number of people transferring to four-year institutions in STEM-related areas is accelerating enormously. Long Beach City College and Long Beach ISD, fundamentally rechanging how we actually coordinate and articulate work across systems. This is going to be critical. Why is it hard? Because community colleges remember when they were part of K-12. They have a creation myth of separating from K-12, and whenever they talk about reconnecting, it activates in the genome some kind of immune response. All right? And we have to be very careful about this, because students all need some form of higher education, and we need to stop thinking of artificial barriers between high school and college. The 12th year needs to be an innovation zone. Look at the places that have early college high schools, massive dual and concurrent enrollment. We used to think, in most states still have legislation that only college-ready kids can do dual enrollment. It turns out to be the non-college-ready kids who are benefiting most from it. Right? So we need to re-examine policies that artificially limit students' progression to higher ed. Higher ed loves college readiness because it frames the problem as someone else's responsibility. The most creative act in American higher ed today in most places is blocking the upward flow of accountability and transparency. People are terrified of it, but we need to get past that and reconnect centrally to students moving through. Last piece of myth is that systems will solve the problem. This idea is so stunning that everyone has their 10 practices. For those of you who are organizational theorists, DiMaggio and Powell, neo-institutionalism, institutions don't actually optimize for quality. They optimize for legitimacy. That's why all police departments, which are locally run, look identical. Studies in the nanotechnology and biotech industries have shown that within 6 months of new innovative industries, they're structurally identical within 6 months, because that's driven by the VC and funding. They need to be perceived as legitimate. Did I hear the word MOOC? Literally, presidents are giving these idiots millions of dollars. They don't know what the hell it is, but they need a MOOC. So they want MOOC for poor kids. They want MOOCs for developmental education. It's amazing. This is optimizing for legitimacy, and it's what organizational theory projects. But systems are not going to solve this problem alone. Every study of minority student success and first-gen success, Kay McClenny's beautiful studies, SESI studies, NESI studies, SEN studies, my studies of interviews with 700 students, sophomores, more than half the successful candidates named an individual who they assign responsibility for their success. We're not